Today we're going to be talking about data fetching in Sveltekit. We're going to go through some conceptual high-level stuff on how this works, talk about layouts and how those edge cases kind of filter into the data fetching, and then finally we're going to go through a code example which shows all this stuff off. I have it linked down below. It's fully open source. You're free to take a look at that. I'll have timestamps on this video so you can kind of jump around to the parts that you need to see, and yeah, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about here is going to be the mental model of data fetching that I sort of use. Sveltekit is a meta framework, so obviously it exists on both the server and the client. And there are a couple places where this gets a little bit confusing, so I wanted to really kind of visualize this out and show you what you can and can't do in each place. So the two resources we're going to be talking about mostly today are going to be the database and an external public API. And these two are really kind of stand-ins for just the database is any backend resource which can only be accessed on your server because it needs environment variables or a private connection or something along those lines. And then an external public API is some external service, like maybe a Golang backend for your application or some other just random data API that you're fetching, which you can do from the client. It's publicly available, just kind of rate limited or something. Maybe you need to pass it an auth header or something like that. But again, that can also be done from the client. So what I want to talk about here is where all of these four pieces live and what they can and can't fetch with regards to these two. So the first one we'll kind of talk about is going to be the page.server.ts. And specifically, this is the load function. We're not going to get really into form actions in this video. There's a lot of good resources on those already out there. They might be worth a dedicated video in the future, but for today, we're just talking about the loading section. So in this case, it's going to be the load function. So the page.server.ts is able to fetch from the database and from an external public API. So this can do both of these things. The next thing would be the server.ts. This is where we can expose like normal HTTP endpoints like a GET request or a POST request. This is also able to fetch from the database. This is also able to fetch from an external public API. Then it starts to get a little weirder because we have our little page.ts file here. This page.ts exists right here. Because if you're running Sveltekit in the sort of normal Sveltekit default mode, whenever you go to a page or whatever, this page.ts, the load function, will actually be run server side the first time. But then after the page has been hydrated and you've loaded down the data, any future runs of that page.ts will actually be run client side. So it can run on both the client and the server. It's called a universal function. So this cannot connect to the database, but it can connect to an external public API. So we can't access anything private within there. And then finally, of course, we have fetching from the client, which will exist squarely on the client. You do like maybe an on-mount fetch request or something. That fetch could go out to a server.ts, or it could go out to something like an external public API. But this obviously can't directly access anything private. It has to fetch out to some private backend service like a server.ts or some external facing service. Something I heard Rich Harris talking about in an interview a while ago is this idea of Sveltekit having two trees, a rendering tree and a data tree. And I kind of wanted to use that to explain how a lot of these things work, because I know when you're new to Sveltekit and you're not used to the way this framework works, there can be a lot of confusion with the way all of the different plus whatever files work. There are a ton of them. I think I'll go through and list these out for both trees, but there's like the pages, there's the page.svelts, there's the page.ts's, there's the page.servers, there's the layouts, there's all these things which do very different things, but they kind of exist to make up these two different trees. The rendering tree is the tree that actually displays data out to the users. This is where the page.svelte would live. This is where the layout.svelte would live. So this is the stuff that actually displays markup to the end user. Then over here on the data tree side of things, this is where the plus page.ts would live, the plus page.server.ts would live, the plus layout.server.ts would live, the plus layout.ts, the plus server.ts. So over here on the data tree, this is where the data fetching actually happens. Now, for this example, we're not going to talk too much about the server.ts because these are just API endpoints, so they're really not part of the special Sveltekit data model. It's just API routes. So we're not going to talk about that here. Really what I want to go over is going to be the load functions and form actions and how those relate to the pages and the layouts. So let's use this as an example right here. Let's say that in this app over here, in our rendering tree, we have a node right here, and this is going to be the root. In this case, these boxes that I've drawn are directories. Sveltekit heavily utilizes file-based routing, so the trees are built based on the file system. So we would have our root directory of our roots right here, and then we would have a subdirectory right here of this sub. So the first thing we'll have in here is within our rendering tree, we're going to have a plus page.svelte. This page.svelte is going to result in whenever we go to just the root of our application, we're going to display out the page that is marked by this page.svelte. Now we're also going to have in here, we're going to have a plus layout.svelte. Now this layout.svelte will also display at this root right here, but since it's a layout, it's going to also display for everything. It's going to display around all of the children in the rendering tree. So if we go down here into this sub, this layout.svelte is also going to exist and wrap around this sub. But what gets interesting for the layouts is they only work on children. So if we added in another layout over here, so I'm going to make this a green layout, this layout that exists on the subroot, if I added another node down here, and then we connect this up right here, this second sub is going to have both of these. So in this case, this second sub would be wrapped by both layout.svelte. So we would have the initial one, which is wrapping everything, and then it would be wrapped by the green. And then finally down here, if we add in our page.svelte, this is what will actually render out at this root. So this is sort of how the rendering tree works. The pages are what create the actual pages that you see on the website, and then the layouts are the things that wrap the pages on the website. Now, if we went in here for some reason and we got rid of this page.svelte and there was no page here, if we went to /sub, we'd get a 404. There wouldn't be anything there. But if we can still add these layouts in here and make it so that if we go to sub/second sub and we have a page.svelte there, then we would just get these two layouts wrapping this page.svelte. Now getting over into the data tree land, this is when things get a little bit more complicated, but it's also why it's so important to kind of visualize this as two different trees. So again, we have this rendering tree, which is creating the markup, which you see on screen. And then there is a parallel tree over here, which is existing in the exact same directory. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in here. And you can imagine that this exists no matter what, because again, these trees, their shape is being defined by the file structure. So even if I don't have any of these files created, we just have the markup, this data tree still exists, it's just not in use. So you can always imagine that these two trees are exactly the same. It's just a question of what we stick into each node. So the first thing we're going to create is a load function within our page.server.ts on the root of the data tree. Whenever we're talking about the page.server.ts or the page.ts, these map to the corresponding node in the other tree. So this node and this node are mapped together, and the page.server in the data tree maps to the page.svelte in the rendering tree. So this page.server.ts, the result of this load function will be available in this page.svelte, but it will not be available in any of these layout.sveltes, and it will not be available in this page.svelte because they're not in the same place. And in the actual project, you would just see this as them being in the same directory. It's honestly probably a little more confusing to see this in the tree model when we're just talking about the page.server or whatever. But when we start talking about layouts, you'll see why this tree model is useful. So another thing we can add in here would be a page.ts. Now this page.ts makes things a little different because like I said, it's a universal loader, and we are able to have a page.server.ts and a page.ts existing on the same exact file. But if this happens, you do have to add an extra step, and I'll show this when we get into the code, but the data from the page.server is normally just passed directly into the page.svelte via the export let data thing, or I guess it's now const data equals $props in the new runes model, which we'll be using in this video. But in this case, since we have this page.ts over here, we're actually going to have to pass the data into the page.ts and then from the page.ts into our page. So there's one extra step there. I'll show you that in the code. But again, the mental model of this is basically the same. This page.ts corresponds to this node, which corresponds to this page. It doesn't show up down here, doesn't show up down here. It's pretty simple. Now we're going to talk about the layout.server.ts and all that stuff, and really the whole reason I made this giant diagram, because it's the easiest way to show it. So I'm going to add up here, I'm going to add a plus layout.server.ts. So now that we have this layout.server.ts, this is where things get a little trickier, because this layout.server is going to work similarly to the layout.sveltes down here, as in it's going to cascade all the way down the tree from here. So this data from this layout.server.ts is going to be available in all of these subroutes. What we can do is within these, we can do within the load function itself, we can await the parent data. And if we get the parent data, we'll be able to, within a page.server.ts file right here, we'll be able to get the data from this layout.server.ts. And the other important thing about this is the data from this layout.server.ts is going to be available all the way down this tree and also all the way down this tree. So this will be available in this page, it will be available in these layouts, and it will be available in this page. So basically the layout will cascade down the tree, which in the code would look like it'll cascade down the file system. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get into the code base here pretty soon. And I won't belabor this point too much because I feel like I've gone over this pretty well by now. But the last one would be if we added a layout.ts. This will do the exact same thing. The data loaded from this will be passed all the way through all these routes. It'll be available over here, and it is the same principle of we need to pass things down through this to get it to work over here. So now that we've talked about how all this stuff works, let's go through the code example. This is the little example application I built out for this. It's basically just a ton of different data sources that we're fetching in order to get this to work. I went ahead and open sourced this project. I'll have it linked down below and you can go through and kind of see all the code for this. I have a little getting started in here on how to do it. I ended up needing a database to really show off the database stuff, and I just kind of used Terso because it's free and it was kind of the quickest and easiest. I usually use Supabase for my projects, but in this case, SQLite felt better. It was the first thing I saw in the Drizzle docs, so I'm like, yeah, why not? So you got to make sure you get that put together, and then you can run this example locally. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go through this code base and kind of show off how all of these different things work in the actual code. And we're going to start over here with fetching from the client. So the syntax to fetch from the client is pretty simple. In this case, I'm just doing it in an effect, which is basically just the on mount of Svelte 5. Whenever we mount this page, we're going to go ahead and fetch to /API. We're going to get the data, type it, and then just console.log. If we go up here and we inspect element, look at our console from page.svelte, we'll have our little user to-dos in there, nothing crazy. This is very much not the preferred way to do data fetching. All of the other ways we're going to show off in a second here are much better. But it's important to note that this is an option. And also, I think this is a good way to sort of transition into the plus server.ts routes. So like I said, we can define these API endpoints, which are entirely server-side with plus server.ts. In this case, I'm going directly into my database from this API endpoint. I'm just returning it as JSON, and then we're calling it from the client. We're also able to call these API endpoints from our load functions and form actions and other things like that, which allows us to do some really cool stuff, especially if you bring in another framework like Hono or something like that, but that is well beyond the scope of this video. We'll talk about that another day. So the next sort of data fetching thing I want to talk about will just be the sample to-dos and sample CSS colors. The way I'm fetching these two is one of these is from a database, one of these is from an external API. If we go into our page.server.ts over here, remember this exists squarely on the server, not on the client at all. If we go to our page.server, the first thing we're going to do within our load functions is we're just going to grab our user to-dos from the database. And then another thing that I'm going to do in here is I'm going to fetch the sample data from /API. So you can see right here, I'm console.logging out our data. If you go into my terminal right here, you can see from the page.server.ts, we're getting the user to-dos, just calling that API endpoint. And since we're using the special fetch from the load function, this will be properly cached and it'll do the deduping on the back end. There's a lot of really great stuff Sveltekit does under the hood to make this work. So that's another way we can do data fetching. Another thing that I think is important to talk about here is that I'm actually streaming some data in. I didn't talk about this beforehand. This is something you can do on platforms that support it. Vercel does. I don't think raw AWS Lambda does, so that means that you can't do it on Netlify or just raw using Lambdas, which is a bit unfortunate. But effectively the way this works is instead of just returning data, because like this user to-dos, we can see it's just an array of data, we can return promises from our load function. And if we return this promise, so you can see right here, we're delaying 500 milliseconds and then generating a bunch of random words, whatever we want to do there. This will actually, into our page.svelte, is going to return a promise. So you can see right here, we have this random strings as a promise. If we go down here into our markup, I'm awaiting data.randomString, so we put in this loading state, and then when we get random strings, so an array of strings, we print these out. And this is an extremely useful way to instantly get data onto the page for the user and then stream in the rest of this. We heavily utilize this at Insider Viz. It's made the site a lot better because there's a lot of stuff that we need to get instantly, like the SEO stuff, but then like the graph and the more complicated stock data, that doesn't need to show up until later. So we can stream that in while getting the important content instantly. So if you want to see what that looks like, over here on the project, you might have noticed it earlier, but when I refresh the page, it'll say loading strings over here for about 5 seconds, and then it'll pop in our random strings. Then the next thing we're doing here is you can see we're returning the user to-dos and the random strings, but on this page, we also have these sample CSS colors, and that's where the page.ts comes in. Remember back in our model over here, this page.ts exists on the boundary of the server and the client, so it can fetch from public APIs, not from the database, and that's what we're doing here. We're fetching from just a little sample API to get some random CSS color names. We're typing the data. And then we're also going through in here. Remember I said when we're dealing with both a page.server.ts and a page.ts on the same node in the data tree, we need to make sure that we pass the data from the page.server into the page.ts, or else it won't be available on the page.svelte. So I'm going ahead and grabbing random strings, grabbing sample to-dos, and I'm returning all of this down to the client. So you can see the random strings is a promise. Again, it's really cool that we can pass promises down through these pages, and then we're passing in the sample to-dos, and then we're going to consume all of these on the page. So I go back to the page.svelte. The syntax for this in Svelte 5 is really simple. We just do $props and deconstruct data. And you can see on data, I have my fake layout data, my sample CSS colors, my sample to-dos, and my random strings, which is a promise. And then we just print out all this markup down here. Super simple. Now, when I went over all that stuff, there was one in here which we haven't talked about yet, which is the fake layout data. The fake layout data is coming from this layout.server.ts. I didn't feel like adding another data source. I mean, you can see how databases work, how external APIs work. In this case, I'm just hard coding some data in here and returning it from the server function. So again, remember this layout.server.ts runs on the server. We're returning this layout data. And if you remember from the data tree from before, the data from this layout.server is going to be available here and here and here and here and here. So we pass it all the way down. So I'm going to go down into this subdirectory right here. If I go into my page.svelte and we look at the data, we can see I have my fake layout data on the type. The page itself, there's nothing on the data tree for this page. So none of this, it doesn't have a page.server, it doesn't have a layout.ts, it just has the data from that initial layout.server.ts. And if I wanted to, I can show you the way you kind of get the layout data in like a load function. If I went in here and I did plus page.server.ts, I'm going to go ahead and say export const load equals async pop. We'll do this. And the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to grab the parent object from right here. And I'm going to say const parent data, or I guess actually we'll deconstruct this. So we'll say this equals await parent. So we'll do this, and then we will do fake layout data. And now we can get our fake layout data within the page.server. This page.server exists on a node, which is a child of the original root. The layout gets this data, passes it down all the way through here. We consume it right here. And then let's say const fake layout data length equals fake layout data dot length. And then we'll just do return fake layout data length. We'll do that. And then if we go back over to this page.svelte and we look at our data, we now get the length right here. So I'm just going to go down here and I'll just say p array length. And then we'll just say data.fake layout data length. Super simple. Let's wrap this in a p tag as well. There we go. So now we go back over the site and I go to the sub page. You can see the array length is 5. We have all this data right here. And then of course, just to illustrate once again, if we go up to our page.svelte, remember these page.server.ts's only exist for nodes at the same part of the tree. So since these are at different points in the tree, if we go right here, we do not have the length of the fake sample data. Even though we have the fake layout data, we don't have the stuff passed from this page.server. And it'd be the same thing where we don't have the page.server data down here in this page. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to go over today when it comes to rendering. I know this was quite a long video, but we went over a ton of very important stuff here. Like I said, this code base is linked link down below. It'll have all of the different examples in there and should be a good place for you to start. I'll also link some images to the diagrams we made in this video because I think those are pretty useful. And yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe. We'll be talking much more about Sveltekit in the future. Thank you for watching and have a great day.